Hey, welcome back, everyone. I want to talk a bit more about the case with Trump because, well, we've seen basically the response now. Typically, you can get a general idea of where a case is going to head, especially when it's politicized. Like, let's be honest, this one is. You can get a good sense where it's going to head by looking at the narratives from both sides. And something very interesting is happening with the charges brought against Trump in New York, which is both, well, Republicans acted like you kind of thought they would. Typically they're getting behind Trump. You would generally expect that. What was somewhat unexpected was even the anti-Trump Republicans got behind Trump. And then something very telling took place, something I actually did not anticipate would take place, which is a lot of the left is getting behind Trump. And this includes most of the major media. I will show you. New York Times, CNN, Washington Post. They're all, I mean, even though they say in their own writings that they still believe Trump should be, put in jail for other things, and they still state their opinion that they very much dislike him and want to see him imprisoned. They actually say this, some of them. They note that the case that DA Alvin Bragg brought against Trump is really, really flawed and will probably fail, and frankly makes them look bad. And not only does it make them look bad, but it'll probably actually damage the integrity of other legal cases that a lot of them want to see brought against Trump, namely the January 6th case, the Georgia case, and the classified documents case. They believe this is the weakest of the four, and who knows how many more they could bring. And they believe that this will actually damage pretty much their entire agenda with trying to charge him. It's very interesting the way this has gone. I'm going to show you all this today, folks. We're going to go over the updates on this. Frankly, it's turning out kind of as I said it would, which, as I told you all last week, it's very, very weak. It'll probably go nowhere, and it's probably going to help Trump in the end, ironically. It's honestly kind of what we suspected. Let's just be honest with ourselves. Let's go over it, folks. That said, those of you Twitter, YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, we will jump over exclusively to Epoch TV after about 25 minutes, so be sure to join us there. And folks, as always, thank you for being here. That said, happy late Easter, by the way, as well. Let's jump into the first story, folks. Let me show you. The left-wing establishment media is breaking ranks, something you don't often see them do. And they're actually criticizing the case that AG Alvin Bragg has brought against Donald Trump in New York. I'll show you first off, New York Times, folks. This is New York Times. It says, Trump's charges bring doubts, hopes, and uncertainty in both parties. Very New York Times headline. I won't go over the whole thing, but it says this further in. To some Republicans and Democratic leaders, including former and current elected officials, strategists, and others, because they mention a whole bunch of people here, the charges appeared to be flimsy. A hodgepodge of bookkeeping accusations that felt far less consequential than many had hoped. They say to others in both parties, the charges and attendant spectacle were troubling and had the potential to reverberate and hurt the former president politically. So, to be generally what we thought. The New York Times, at least in this article, is kind of split. New York Times in this article notes the case is weak. They note that DA Alvin Bragg really didn't meet expectations with it. They note, as many others did, that DA Alvin Bragg basically took the same charge and repeated it 34 times slightly differently, and then also elevated 34 misdemeanors, if even they were crimes, elevated them to felonies using very shaky legal grounds, and didn't even mention the charge. Didn't even mention the federal crime that would justify such an extreme action, especially not to mention for any case at all, not to mention charging a former president of the United States, something that's never been done before, and not to mention, again, getting rid of precedent and, again, executive privilege, and also going against the leading political candidate for the Republican Party. You would normally have to have something really really serious to justify such an extreme action. And not only has Alvin Bragg not demonstrated that, in fact, even the misdemeanor charges that he elevated were already past the statute of limitations. He can't even legally charge him with those. The justification he used to basically throw out all this precedence, to go against everything, to go against the leading candidate for a political party during an election, and even the main challenger to the standing president, and to violate, again, executive privilege, he doesn't even state the law Trump violated to justify such an action. That's how weak it is. New York Times goes a little further in an opinion piece. Let me show you what they wrote here. New York Times wrote, "The Trump indictment is a legal embarrassment." And I'm emphasizing this because these are normally the individuals you'd see, typically they're very anti-Trump. I'll now show you others as well. I'll show you a few others as well. Typically, these media are very, very anti-Trump. In fact, even in the articles, they still cannot basically hold in their direct statements of hatred for Trump. But they note, despite that the case Alvin Bragg has brought against Trump is so weak, so flimsy, and as New York Times notes, such a legal embarrassment, and those are their exact words, a legal embarrassment, that they can't help but criticize Alvin Bragg over Trump. That's how weak it is, and that's how, frankly, ridiculous it is. Let me show you. It says, Tuesday was historic for the rule of law in America, but not in the way Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney, would have imagined. The 34-count indictment, which more accurately could be described as 34 half indictments, was a disaster. It was a setback for the rule of law and established a dangerous precedent for prosecutors. Folks, I would actually agree with New York Times on this. It has established a dangerous precedent. Do you know what that dangerous precedent is? That former presidents can now be charged criminally. Of course, the case they brought against Trump is a very, very weak one. A very, very weak one. But frankly, the charges that could be brought against other individuals who were formerly in office, frankly, the evidence there is much, much stronger. And frankly, could be something much, much more consequential. Regardless of the fact, I assume that's what they're referring to. The dangerous precedent for prosecutors that is now established. But they continue stating this. The legal embarrassment, and they're referring to AG Alvin Bragg's case against Trump, this legal embarrassment reveals new layers of Trumpian damage to the legal foundations of the United States. Folks, how does this add new layers to the Trumpian damage to the legal foundations of the United States? Trump is damaging America by being unethically charged for a crime that was already past statute of limitations. How is Trump responsible for this? Regardless, New York Times says this. They're acknowledging that the case Alvin Bragg brought against Trump is a, quote, legal embarrassment. But they're saying that it reveals new layers of Trump's damage to the legal foundations of the United States. How did he damage the legal foundations? Did he basically incite Alvin Bragg to develop a mental problem and to violate all these different precedents and to come up with random charges that are, as they note, a legal embarrassment? And that's Trump's fault somehow? This is New York Times for you folks. But regardless, they say this. Mr. Trump's opponents react to his provocations and norms violations by escalating and accelerating the erosion of legal norms. Do you get what New York Times is saying here? They're saying that it's Trump's fault that the people who dislike him are going to such extremes. They're accusing Trump of Alvin Bragg, as they say, reacting to Trump's own provocations and norms violations. They're saying Trump provokes people and violates norms, and that people escalate what he's done and accelerate the destruction of legal norms. And so they're blaming Trump for basically charges brought against him that violate legal norms. That's the logic New York Times is presenting here. And again, you can read it yourself. But they also say this. They say the case appears so weak on its legal and jurisdictional basis, again, AG Alvin Bragg's case, that a state judge might dismiss the case and mitigate that damage. More likely, the case is headed to federal court for a year, where it could lose on the grounds of federal preemption. They say only federal courts have jurisdiction over campaign finance and filing requirements, meaning Alvin Bragg can't even technically, try this case in New York. This should be, again, as they note, a federal court, which is one of the many, many things Alvin Bragg is basically throwing to the wind in order to go after Trump. And New York Times, again, is acknowledging it. They say, even if it survives a challenge that could reach the Supreme Court, a trial would most likely not start until at least mid-2024, possibly even after the 2024 election. Ironically, they're suggesting here the politicized nature of this case, because they're suggesting that, again, Trump would probably the elections would be over, and Trump would either be irrelevant or Trump would be president. Again, that's what they're suggesting here. And ironically, by saying the trial most likely will not start until at least mid-2024, possibly even after the 2024 election, New York Times is subtly acknowledging here the politicized nature of this case. This is meant to try to prevent Trump from running for president. This is designed, right? This is designed to damage Trump's campaign. And they're noting, instead of the rule of law, it would be the rule of the circus. They're suggesting again that, subtly again, that I believe they think this will help Trump. It's not just New York Times. This is CNN, folks. CNN, which is, keep in mind, you have a lot of media that really represent, they're almost like the mouthpieces of certain parties. To an extent, CNN is like the mouthpiece of the more moderate Democrats. And I know that sounds crazy, but, NBC is much more extreme than them. ABC is much more extreme than them. New York Times, ironically, is much more extreme than them. They're more like, and I think they're trying to position themselves as such, trying to be more the moderate Democratic voice. But what is essentially the the mouthpiece of them, CNN, states why New York's hush money case against Donald Trump is viewed as risky. And CNN states, the case the Manhattan prosecutors brought against former President Donald Trump for allegedly falsifying business records to disguise hush money payments related to the 2016 campaign presents novel legal questions that make the prosecution risky, but not impossible, legal experts say. And they say further in, Manhattan prosecutors have teased three different potential underlying crimes that could support the felony charges, but each presents their own assortment of novel legal questions. Now, folks, novel, when you're talking about law, and you're talking about, again, even going after a former president of the United States, which normally never happens, and you're talking about going after a leading political candidate, which you normally don't do, you better have precedent for it. What they're suggesting here is that all three of the main charges they're bringing against Trump, all three things that would even support the idea of elevating misdemeanors to felonies, all of them have some type of, what they say, novel legal questions. Novel legal questions mean it's never been done before. Novel legal questions means you're violating precedent. Novel in and of itself suggests that the historical foundation to do such a thing is not there. They acknowledge throughout the article, they're trying to, I think, placate. They're trying to sell it to some extent to the readers, it appears, while also noting that it's probably not going to work. If you read the article, that's the gist of what it says. And I'll show you one more, folks. Washington Post. This is Jeff Bezos Media, right? The guy who owns Amazon. And basically saying the same thing. Bezos, who changed the tagline of the Washington Post to "Democracy dies in darkness," as a swipe at Trump, which was kind of the way it was framed in the beginning. Very much anti-Trump, very much outspoken against Trump. Also are somewhat agreeing, well, mostly agreeing with the New York Times and CNN. The case is weak. The case probably will not succeed, and the case, ironically, is probably going to help Trump. And they say this further in. The hard question is whether those efforts also violated the criminal law. Specifically, now that a New York grand jury has indicted him on 34 felony counts, whether they violated the laws of the state of New York. On that front, the indictment unsealed on Tuesday is disturbingly unilluminating. They're criticizing DA Alvin Bragg's indictment. And they say, and the theory on which it rests is debatable at best, unnervingly flimsy at worst. You get that? What we all talked about last week. Remember, I was probably a little too light last week because of this. Because this thing cannot stand on its own 2 feet. It is so ridiculously flimsy. It is so ridiculously hollow that even people who desperately want to see Trump thrown behind bars are noting this is not the case to do it. This is not the way to do it. This is not only not going to achieve what they want to achieve, it's not even going to probably be done before the elections. Again, at which time, when this is finally done and over with, Trump is either going to be president or he's going to be politically irrelevant. One of the two. And even regardless, it's flimsy. He'll probably get a slap on the wrist even if he is found guilty for it. But they note, that is a scary situation when it comes to the first criminal charges ever lodged against the former president. The individual in this opinion piece says, I'm not saying prosecutors will lose this case. They could well win, and I hope they do. This is not me saying it. This is Washington Post. And they say because a failure to secure a conviction will only inflame Trump and his supporters in their claim that the criminal justice system is being weaponized against them. Frankly, I would argue that a conviction will probably do more to make people believe that the criminal justice system is being weaponized, because a case that even Washington Post, New York Times, and CNN notes is legally flimsy, goes against precedent, is novel in many cases, and doesn't even state the law, the federal crime that Trump violated, something actually which could violate the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution, which I'll explain later. It probably does. If you go against all the things they're noting here, and you still convict somebody, to me, that would be weaponization of government. To me, that would be wrongful prosecution. And to me, I think that would actually inflame Trump and his supporters much, much more than him just getting off, on the charges. And people saying, well, that's corrupt Alvin Bragg. That's not the entire justice system. We'll see where it goes. But again, Washington Post continues. They say, but the fears I had in the weeks leading up to the indictment about the strength of the case against Trump were in no way allayed by Tuesday's developments. The indictment and an accompanying recitation of the underlying facts offers almost nothing in the way of new evidence against Trump. And if it offers, folks, this is my part, if it offers no new evidence in the case against Trump, that's going to bring up a lot of issues. Like, for example, why did DA Alvin Bragg previously look at the same evidence being used in this case, and decide not to prosecute Trump previously? What was the change in decision-making that led him to make that decision previously, where he's gone against that with no new evidence? Why was it that when two of his prosecutors left, and one of whom wrote a book and then did a media tour on the ongoing investigation on the same evidence, why did he allow that to happen? Which actually could again poison the jury pool and throw the whole thing out in a normal criminal case. Why did Bragg suddenly change? In other words, if the evidence has not changed, and is just a basic legal matter, that's going to be one of the big issues that's probably going to, frankly, put Bragg in the hot seat, which we'll get into further into this episode. For example, the House Judiciary Committee and the Weaponization of Government, commission, they're looking into Bragg. The Washington Post continues, and I'll go into some other stuff after this. They say, no surprise here. The tawdry details of Trump's catch-and-kill scheme to suppress damaging information from adult film actress Stormy Daniels and former Playboy model Karen McDougal about their relationships with Trump have already been well aired. They say further in, don't be fooled by the 34 counts. That healthy-sounding number doesn't signify anything about the strength of the case. They will all rise or fall together depending on whether prosecutors' theory of the case holds up. Again, because, folks, it's one charge repeated 34 times on very flimsy ground. One charge that is a misdemeanor, which has been, again, elevated to a felony using very shaky legal grounds on a criminal charge that Alvin Bragg does not even state in the indictment, which, again, could be a violation of the Sixth Amendment, meaning Bragg might be violating the Constitution even in that action. But they conclude here. Again, maybe this is in Washington Post. Again, maybe Bragg's theory of the case will turn out to be solid, maybe not, but this feels like a dangerous leap on the highest of wires. Folks, it is turning out exactly how I thought it would, and exactly like we discussed it probably would. And it's interesting to see. It's actually interesting to see the, frankly, establishment media, which is very openly against Trump, which very openly, again, all these articles, they clearly state their bias, that they want to see Trump behind bars. Despite that desire, despite the fact that they want this to work, interestingly, most of them are noting it probably will not work. And it looks like they're trying to tee up their supporters and their readers into basically being prepared for the fact that it's probably not going to go anywhere. And at the very least, it's not going to be done before the elections are over. So this is in no way going to do what I believe they want it to do, which some of them even suggest openly, which is they want something that will stop Trump. They openly want this case to stop Trump. And what they're saying everywhere between the lines is this is not only not going to stop Trump, it's empowering him. It's enraging him. It's giving him the quote-unquote fire and fury that his campaign was actually lacking this time around. It has brought that back, and it has pushed Trump into the forefront of the whole public debate. Trump went from being, again, he has his supporters, don't get me wrong. But a lot of media were not covering him. A lot of media were not airing his speeches. A lot of media were just trying to write him off, including almost all the Murdoch media. That means Fox News. That means Wall Street Journal. That means New York Post. They had basically pushed Trump to the sideline, and they were giving more coverage to Pence and DeSantis and others because they don't want Trump to be the center stage of the public discussion. This has ironically put Trump smack dab in the middle of the public discussion to the point where I've done multiple episodes on it, and I wasn't really covering that much either, just generally speaking, because there wasn't a whole lot of interesting stuff happening, to be honest, other than, again, his campaign speeches where he's laying out his campaign talking points. This is ironically putting Trump at the forefront of American politics, and Trump is becoming the debating point, and Trump's message, again, being the government is corrupt. Trump's message being that the solution to that is to fire a lot of the deep state or career politicians. And Trump's message that corruption needs to be cleaned out in other ways, including maybe dissolving the FBI or different parts of federal agencies and restructuring them. Something that to non-Trump supporters does come off as kind of a little extreme, just being honest. But again, Alvin Bragg has made this the central debate for the country, and they're unhappy about it. Going further, Fox News. John Bolton panics over Trump's charges, saying even weaker than I thought. They say further in, this is former National Security Advisor John Bolton. And John Bolton says that he was not impressed with Bragg's case against Trump. And he said, quote, this is John Bolton speaking as someone who very strongly does not want Donald Trump to get the Republican presidential nomination. I'm extraordinarily distressed by this document, referring to the charges against Trump. Bolton told CNN. He said, I think this is even weaker than I feared it would be. And this is someone who wants to see Trump out. Again, Bolton is a Yale Law School graduate, and it says that he feared the case would, quote, easily get dismissed, even before it goes to trial. Fox says Bragg was just wrong to suggest that New York election law could supersede federal election law, he argued. That's AG Alvin Bragg. And he said, quote, and I just want what I understand the district attorney to say that he thinks, right, sorry, not AG, DA. He's saying that for DA Alvin Bragg to, quote, say that he thinks there's a New York election law involved here, which is the basis of a lot of these charges, all I can say is the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 absolutely preempts any state or local law to the contrary. How could it be otherwise? You've got one law governing corporate finance in a presidential election at the federal level. You're going to have 50 state laws interfering with it. So he's just wrong on the applicability of the New York statute. And this is someone who wants to see Trump out, John Bolton. And that's like one of the main core pillars of the entire charge, 34 charges against Trump, trying to use New York law to supersede federal law, essentially, while still arguing it's a federal crime, not a local, misdemeanor crime. It's a bizarre charge. The charges against Trump are bizarre. They're legally bizarre, and they're very, very, very flimsy. Yeah, again, they add here, last part, earlier this week, Bolton feared that the indictment of Donald Trump would ultimately help the former president politically. And he said, quote, on Sunday on CBS, if Trump is acquitted or he gets the case dismissed because it's not legally sufficient, and he continues further in, that will be rocket fuel because he can say, I told you this was a political prosecution, as we've all been talking about. Now, that being said, the Trump team is laying out its strategy for how to deal with this case. They're coming out and explaining some of this. For the rest of this, though, folks, I want to go into that. I want to talk about the F.E.C., already tossing out some of this. The F.E.C., the Federal Election Commission, is actually coming out now and saying the Stormy Daniels case is not a campaign finance violation. You're seeing the federal government basically step in here and challenge Alvin Bragg to an extent. You're seeing a break between. Let me explain this. You're seeing a break among the media establishment. You're seeing a break among the anti-Trump establishment. You're seeing a break even between the Democrats at the state level and the Democrats at the federal level. This is a major just fissure in the entire argument brought against Trump. And if the federal government, if this is politicized, if we believe this is politicized, if the Biden administration does not stop Alvin Bragg soon, and it may be the damage is already done, this case is going to damage any of the other legal cases they want to bring against Trump. This is going to damage the Georgia case. This is going to damage the classified documents case. This is going to damage the whole J6 case, all of which have their own really legally shaky elements built into them. But those are the cases they want, I think, in front of the whole public. And instead, we're debating first the weakest, most flimsy one that absolutely looks like politicized prosecution, that completely looks politicized and is going against precedent, is going against basic, legal standards on going against former presidents and political candidates. And even from a normal legal standpoint, even if you or I were facing charges like this, there are things that, DA Alvin Bragg is doing that normally you would not legally be able to do, that would be considered prosecutorial misconduct, that could even get the individual themselves. Alvin Bragg may be charged with this. I'll explain the Sixth Amendment violation that he's possibly committing. And frankly, from every standpoint, in other words, this case is weak and basically looks like what Trump is telling people the problem is, that you now have a politicized justice system that is targeting Americans for unethical reasons with the intent to basically manipulate the legal system in ways that benefit one political party over another. Here we are, folks. We'll get into Trump's strategy for the case. That said, let's jump over to Epoch TV. Before we jump over, though, Roman Balmakov, my colleague, he's doing a documentary about the food crisis and the agenda to have people eat bugs. And they're looking to do some fundraising to finish up the production on this. Let me show you the trailer for that, or Roman talking about it, and then we'll go further into these stories.
For the past 6 months or so, my team and I have been working on a full-length documentary project. It's called Eat the Bugs, and it exposes a topic that I believe is incredibly important to everyone: the global war on farmers and the, you can say, secret agenda that's behind it, that secret agenda that's pushing it forward. Now, as many of you know, this all started when my team and I traveled to the Netherlands last year in order to cover the protests that were happening there. And after meeting with the local farmers and hearing their stories about how they were going to quite literally lose their generational farms, we were shocked, to say the least. But what we realized soon, as we dug deeper into the story, it became obvious that this was not confined to simply the Netherlands. In fact, this war on farmers, this global war on farmers, was indeed happening everywhere, including right here in the US. And for some odd reason, it coincided with this trend of celebrities promoting edible insects. And so we have been traveling for the better part of the last year on a mission to really understand this global war on farmers, the agenda behind it, what it means for the future of the food in our supermarkets, as well as what the common people like you and me who are caught up in all this can actually do about it. And right now, we're putting together all the interviews and all the findings from our journey into this new awesome documentary called Eat the Bugs. I really cannot wait to share it with you. And if you would like to help back this project, to help us with the funding, to finish editing the thing, and as well as to get it out to as many people across the entire world as possible, well, that would be absolutely awesome. You can go to epicoriginal.com/eatthebugs, or you can just click on that link in the description box below, and there you can sign up for updates, you can share the project with your friends and family, and you can donate some funding so that we can share the powerful voices of all these farmers from across the entire world. Let's make it happen.
Again, folks, that's Roman's upcoming documentary. And again, they're also doing fundraising for it. It's called Eat the Bugs. That's epochoriginal.com/eatthebugs. That said, folks, let's jump over to Epoch TV exclusively, and we'll go further into what's happening. So I'll see you there. And folks, thank you for being here. Real quick,